Hey Gina, I just want to talk a little bit about the inspiration for today's episode. I was listening to our friends at the 50/50 podcast. They are a Spanglish podcast hosted by Jesse and Jessica. And it got me to thinking, if I speak in Spanglish. And for some of you who may not know, Spanglish is a combination of English and Spanish, and we're going to delve a little bit more into the roots of it as the episode progresses. But a few weeks ago, my wife and we were at a barbecue, and some guy I don't know asked me, "So you and your wife speak in Spanglish, huh?" And it seemed a little judgmental to me. So I instantly got into defense mode. And I was like, I don't think so. Why? Why do you say that? And he said, well, because I just heard you speaking in Spanish to her, and then you switched in English, and she didn't miss a beat. She just kind of like rolled right with it. And I said, I hadn't thought of it. But thanks for pointing it out, and it just got me to thinking. In the back of my head, I said, I'm so glad that Mrs. Franceschini didn't hear me. She was my Spanish for Spanish speakers teacher, and it was a big no-no in her class to speak Spanglish. So for me, I was like, during this episode, I would love to kind of just see and what we explore. So I'd love to explore kind of what is Spanglish? When was the first reference to Spanglish? Has it become acceptable? So Gina, for you, I just have a question. When was the first time that you heard Spanglish?
Spanglish, I don't even remember. It's been quite a long time. I do remember it was probably survival for me since I came to learn English here in the US that I had to use both languages to get my message across, and probably just out of survival and using some of the languages. But I think for Spanglish use is more of that common handle of both languages, and you just kind of blend them in because you're so fluent in both. You can kind of put them in like a beautiful piece of art. But yet, I love what you said about your teacher, because I did have a supervisor who was very, very clear about Spanglish. She did not like it. She was a linguist advocate. And since I was learning English and learning English, and I was supervised by her, she would not let us also talk or give presentations or do anything that was in Spanglish. She was very, very clear that breaks all rules of proper language acquisition and handling. And to this day, somebody says it's Spanglish, and I get scared if she's watching. It's like that voice of, better, like tu mamá, right? Like tu mamá is watching, somebody's watching. And for us, it was sometimes the temptation to use Spanish even in some of we were doing community outreach, and we were trying to get into the monolingual community, but do use some language in Spanish. And she was very opposed to anything that did not only carry one language. She just said no. There was I remember there was one ad from Dr. Pepper, which became very controversial at the time, but he said something like 23 sabores blended into one extraordinary taste. And to me,
I don't remember that
one. That was controversial, and it was the 23 sabores because it's, of course, in Spanish. But if you say it to me, I was like, oh my gosh, they're speaking to me. They're speaking to my heritage. So interesting enough, Spanglish has so many definitions for so many people. Depending on the geography that you were born and raised, it will carry different connotations. It will carry different pride or shame. And this is why I love this topic today.
And I want to jump into that topic after a quick break. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the LatinX Point of View podcast on your favorite streaming platform. We're on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Spreaker, and Google Play Music. And remember to follow us on Twitter at LatinXPOV, or even email us at latinxpov@gmail.com. We'll be right back.
LatinX Point of View is brought to you by Civic Canvas, a bilingual boutique firm designing strategies for social change. To learn more at civiccanvas.com. So this topic, I love it because we're going to be able to probably put in some phrases in Spanglish. But before that, I didn't know what I was talking about. So I hope you do, because Spanglish is completely. I mean, I'm not a linguist. I don't know anything particularly professional speaking about it, but about Spanglish. But I do use it, so I wanted to dive in. But I'm hoping you got some history or some definition about it. Do you have anything on that?
Yeah, I did a little bit of homework about it, because I said if we're going to dive into this topic, I want to kind of know the history of it, because as you said, it's really interesting. We put it and we practice it. I try not to, as like I said, Mrs. Franceschini would frown on anyone who spoke in Spanglish, and I try not to do it. And I when I'm speaking in one language, I really try to stick with it. But even sometimes on the podcast, Gina, we'll say something, y después te digo algo, and it just kind of flows like that. So we'll incorporate Spanglish into it. So when I was looking at the term Spanglish, the first time it kind of came about, and it was really interesting. The first time it was referenced was in 1948. It was 1948 by a Puerto Rican poet named Salvador Tio. And what he called it was Spanglish with an E. And then he also had another term, because Spanglish was mixing Espanol and English. And then he had, what was it? Inglañol, which was mixing Inglés and Espanol. Which, yeah, Inglañol didn't really take off. I think we kind of went with Spanglish, and then people kind of dropped off the E after a while, and they just took it to Spanglish. So, we want to thank the Puerto Rican poet Salvador Tio for kind of incorporating this term into what we now use as speak, because it was the first reference I was able to find anywhere. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about the history of using English and Spanish, because that goes back even further. It just kind of wasn't like documented. So we know that in the mid 1800s, there was the Mexican-American War. What was northern Mexico, which is now the southern United States, was taken over by the U.S. after the U.S. won the Mexican-U.S. War. So you had people who didn't kind of like say, well, I'm going to move down south now because it's not Mexico anymore. This is the land I've lived on for centuries. And as people who were English speaking started moving into these areas, they just kind of commonly found a way to balance the English and the Spanish. That's kind of where you had the mixture of English and Spanish at first, and kind of watching some like old movies and stuff like that. One of the things that kind of popped out to me and kind of popped in my head was this movie Young Guns. And in the movie Young Guns, it was a cowboy movie with Emilio Estevez, and I think it was Charlie Sheen in it too, and Kiefer Sutherland. And they would make certain references that I would go back now as an adult and think back, man, they were kind of like speaking in Spanish, but with their English accent, and it was incorporated, and it was that area. It was those border towns of the U.S., border towns of Mexico, and they would just kind of interweave the different languages. So for me, that's kind of one of the things that when I started doing some research on the Old West and stuff like that, and we gotta remember, common terms and stuff. So I remember in the movie specifically, there was one guy, and he said, I'm going to use his accent, vaya con Dios. And I was like, wait, what? When I was a kid, I didn't really understand what it meant. And then as I grew as an adult, he was like, vaya con Dios. Yeah. But I wanted to use that as a way of how we view history.
Well, there is actually 13% of Latino population speaks Spanish in U.S. Now, that is only speak Spanish, doesn't mean they're bilingual. But let's say the 13% speak Spanish, and they're going to be using some words that they hear often in English, like yarda, like truck, and they turn into troca. And there are some words that they, by acquisition of common use, they're going to try to import it into the Spanish language. And I think there are no names for that. They're different. What is it called? Long words in Spanish, from English to Spanish. In Costa Rica, we call it anglicismo, when you get that word and then you start using it as part of the language. Now, some anglicismos are allowed by the Real Academia Española, which is our watchdog for language, and some are not. And I think over time they allowed some of these words to creep into our language, but they taking decades and decades until they've been proven to be part of the new evolution of language, because language is an expression of our ethnicity, our diversity, our culture, our resources, and how we come about making sense of the world and how to explain ourselves. Now, the part of what I find it very interesting when you're talking about how you grew up and what you were watching and hearing, because for me it was, of course, was different being born in a different country and then coming here and watching people use the language differently, because there was a little bit of judgment that I felt when I saw people could not completely articulate a sentence in Spanish. It could not carry on a full conversation in Spanish. It felt almost like a deficiency. Or in English as well, they lack the words. And I remember someone early on who taught me, he said, language acquisition is only proven by writing and reading. And there is a big pride in the United States. Part of the staple of education is that if you're a good writer and you're a good reader, then you are a well-developed individual. When you use Spanglish, it shows that you are neither or. And I think that's part of the backslash that we get from using and blending the languages. And so people, of course, look down upon to say, well, you cannot well manage your native language. And when you acquire a second language, it's not up to you to blend it. There's proper ways to manage the language. I wish that, because everybody, I think, will have a Spanish teacher in their life story. And they will need to be able to familiarize themselves with what's proper and what's not proper. And when it's emotional, that you must use the word in Spanish, because there is not one in English that will represent what you're looking for. And so I think there are two schools of thoughts on this. One that says Spanglish is our way to revolutionize and to move on from what we know. And there's pride in that. And like you said, the podcast that kind of there goes against the current, says we are speaking Spanglish, we can do this, it's our language, we do what we want. And there are other school of thought that says, don't you dare to speak that way, because we start losing our proficiency in the language and our need to actually grow our word dictionary to be able to refer to different things, in how to actually become fully proficient in both languages. At home, it is very interesting because we're both from Costa Rica, and we got into a bad habit of speaking Spanglish, and it was very, very difficult, because then we found that it was easier for us to go into Spanglish and not to really stay with the routine of only one language. And we had to step back and say, okay, we're losing our ground of both languages for trying to use both. So we had to step back. I don't know in your household how it goes, but I want to say that the ways that language shows up in signs, conversations, songs, movies, even comedians will use it in ways that are very fluid, and allow us to kind of move into different ways. I don't know. I still have my heart in both spaces, where you should be able to use it when you want, but you should also be fluent in both languages.
Yeah, for me, I wanted to kind of touch on what you had mentioned earlier in terms of the loan words, because I think we're seeing more and more loan words as technology kind of expands, right? Mm-hmm. So some of the loan words that I was able to see was hacerle clic. Hey, have you ever been doing something and explains, mira, hazle clic. And it's like, wait, what? Or mandar un email en vez de un correo electrónico. Or textear. Mira, te voy a textear más tarde. I'm going to text you later. So we have those kind of loan words and kind of how but it kind of reminds me of when I was growing up, in South Florida. That to me, South Florida was the hotbed of Spanglish.
I bet.
And I remember hearing sandwich, un sandwich, instead of sandwich, un sandwich. Or la lonchera. La lonchera is the lady or the guy or el lonchero, however you want to frame it, who had the food truck. So when you were working or something like that, la lonchera would come up, boom, and sell sodas and sandwiches and stuff like that for the construction guys or just any kind of business. So to me, I always found that kind of like mix. I didn't